There's a specific kind of suffering that no one in your church will admit to. The suffering of knowing exactly what you believe and being unable to feel any of it. You know the creed. You could recite it in your sleep, and sometimes sitting in a pew on a Sunday morning, it feels like you are. The words come out correct and complete, and they land nowhere. Not with doubt. Doubt would almost be a relief because doubt is still a form of engagement. This is something quieter and stranger than doubt. It's the sensation of standing on the other side of a glass wall from your own faith, watching it through the window, recognizing it, unable to get back inside. You've been told the explanation. You haven't been praying enough or with enough sincerity, or you've let the noise of the culture in, or you've drifted, and the prescription is always the same. Try harder, pray more, recommit. And you've tried. That's the thing nobody asks about. How hard you've tried. You've done the disciplines. You've sat with the silence. And the silence stayed silence. Here's what I want to offer you today. That explanation is wrong. Not wrong because the disciplines don't matter. They do. Wrong because it misidentifies the wound. What you are living inside has a name. And it is not a name for personal failure. It is a name for something that happened to Western civilization in the 17th century, and from which, in T.S. Eliot's words, we have never recovered. By the time this video is over, you will have that name. You will understand why the gap between what you know and what you feel is not a symptom of weak faith. And you will have seen in the life of one man who lived inside this wound longer and more honestly than almost anyone, what the way through looks like. But I want to begin with the question I'll come back to at the end, because I think it will pull you through what I'm about to say. How did the man who wrote the bleakest poem of the 20th century end up, in his late 60s, describing his life as a kind of joy he hadn't expected to find? Hold that. There's a distinction C.S. Lewis made that your audience probably knows. The difference between knowing about something and actually inhabiting it. Lewis was writing about theology, but he was pointing at something every honest believer over 50 has felt. You can accumulate a lifetime of correct doctrine and find, at the end of it, that doctrine and life are in separate rooms. You know the right things. The knowing hasn't changed what it's like to be you at 3 in the morning. Lewis named the distinction, but he didn't go far enough back to find the cause. T.S. Eliot did. In 1921, Eliot published an essay called The Metaphysical Poets. It was, on the surface, literary criticism, an argument about why poets like John Donne were better than their reputation suggested. But buried inside that argument was a diagnosis that had nothing to do with poetry. Eliot wrote that in the 17th century, something happened to the English-speaking mind. He called it a dissociation of sensibility, and he said, and this is the quote verified against the original essay, that it was a dissociation from which we have never recovered. What he meant was this. Before the 17th century, a poet like Donne could feel his thought as immediately as the odor of a rose. That's Eliot's phrase. Thinking and feeling were a single operation. When Donne encountered an idea, it registered intellectually and emotionally and physically as one experience. The mind didn't hand the thought to the heart for a second processing. They happened together. After the 17th century, they didn't. Something in the intellectual revolution of that era, the rise of what we call the scientific worldview, the separation of the objective from the subjective, the insistence that real knowledge is the kind that can be measured and verified, split the human person into two operations that were supposed to coordinate but increasingly didn't. You could think brilliantly, you could feel intensely, but the two happened in sequence, not simultaneously, and they were increasingly about different things. A person shaped by modernity can reason about God with precision and feel nothing, can analyze their estrangement from their child with clarity and be unable to close the distance, can understand, intellectually, every reason the culture has gone wrong, and find that understanding has changed nothing about the specific grief of watching their grandchildren shaped by a grammar they can't counter. That is not personal weakness. That is what the dissociation of sensibility looks like in a life. Eliot was not making a romantic argument for feeling over thought. He was making a diagnostic argument that the civilization we inherited severed a connection in the human person that was meant to be intact, and that we are all, to varying degrees, living inside that severance. Now here is what the other explanations miss. You cannot think your way back to wholeness. The very instrument you're reaching for, more analysis, more correct doctrine, more understanding of what went wrong, is the same instrument that is, in some sense, the symptom. The dissociation means that more thought produces more thought. It doesn't produce feeling. It doesn't produce action. It produces the sensation of standing behind glass. But I don't want to leave this as an abstraction. I want to show you what this diagnosis looked like in a life. Because Eliot didn't write about the dissociation of sensibility from the outside, the way an anthropologist describes a disease he's observed in others. He wrote about it from the inside. In 1922, when Eliot was 33 years old, he published The Wasteland. You may know the name. You don't need to have read it. What matters for our purposes is what it is. It is the poem of a mind that has absorbed everything Western civilization has to offer, every myth, every language, every literary tradition, and finds it produces no coherent meaning. It is, formally and emotionally, the document of a person for whom knowing has come entirely apart from feeling. The first line is, "April is the cruelest month." The cruelty of April, in Eliot's reading, is that it stirs things to life that have no capacity to actually live. It breeds, as the poem says, lilacs out of the dead land. And the image is of something that looks like growth but isn't. Something that has the appearance of life without the interior reality of it. That is the poem's central wound. And it was Eliot's. He was, by 1922, a man of extraordinary intelligence and genuine suffering. His first marriage to Vivienne Haywood had been catastrophic. Years of what he described in letters as a sustained crisis of two people making each other unhappy with no apparent exit. He was working at a bank. He had had what amounted to a nervous collapse, and he had produced, out of all of it, a poem that was immediately recognized as the defining literary statement of its era. Brilliant, suffering, knowing everything. Feeling, in the way that connects knowing to living, almost nothing. If that sounds familiar, I want you to hold it. 5 years after The Wasteland, in 1927, Eliot did something almost no one expected. He was baptized into the Church of England and confirmed in the Anglican faith. He was 38 years old. He described the decision not as a triumph, but as an act of intellectual honesty. He had concluded carefully that the alternative to a serious system of belief was some form of what he called uncivilized barbarism, a word he used precisely, without drama. And then he wrote Ash Wednesday. If you've ever imagined that conversion is a door you walk through and find yourself, on the other side, feeling what you now know to be true, Ash Wednesday will disabuse you of that immediately. It is not a poem of arrival, it is a poem of someone who has converted and still cannot feel it. The poem opens with a repetition that is not rhetorical. Eliot writes, "Because I do not hope to turn again, because I do not hope, because I do not hope to turn." Read those lines aloud, feel what they do. This is not a man celebrating his new faith. This is a man and the specific suffering of someone who has made the most important decision of his life and is still, on the inside, standing behind glass. He believes. The belief has not yet reached the place where belief becomes experience. The mystics had a name for what Eliot was inside. They called it the dark night of the soul, and they were not embarrassed by it. John of the Cross, whose work Eliot knew, described it not as a failure of faith, but as a stage of faith. The particular suffering of someone for whom the familiar consolations of devotion have gone dark, not because the faith is false, but because the faith is being asked to become something more than consolation. What the mystics understood, and what the easy explanation misses, is that the coal doesn't mean the fire is out. It sometimes means the fire is changing what it burns on. But Eliot didn't know, in 1930, that this was a stage. He was in it. If you're finding this useful, if what I've been describing sounds less like a literary lecture and more like an honest account of where you've been, I want to pause and tell you something. I've written a companion guide called The Second Half, Eliot's Framework for Life After 55. It's built around exactly what we're doing right now, walking through Eliot's biography and his work not as literary history but as a framework for the second half of a life. It covers the conversion that didn't fix everything, the years inside the dark night, and what the way through looked like for a man who found, at 68, a quality of life he hadn't known was still available to him. If you want to go deeper than this video can take you, that's waiting for you in the link in the description. Now, I said at the beginning that I wanted to hold a question. How did the man who wrote the bleakest poem of the century end up describing his late life as a kind of unexpected joy? You might have expected by this point in the video that the answer is he figured it out. He thought his way through. He analyzed the dissociation of sensibility with sufficient precision that the analysis healed it. That is not what happened, and This is the thing I most want you to hear, because I think it is the thing that most directly applies to where you are. Between 1935 and 1942, Eliot wrote the 4 poems that are collectively called 4 quartets. He was between 47 and 54. They are the work of his full maturity, more difficult than The Wasteland in some ways, more accessible in others. And in the second of the 4 poems, Burnt Norton, he wrote the lines that gave this channel its name. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards. At the still point, there the dance is. But neither arrest nor movement. The still point here is what that image is not. It is not a technique. It is not a practice you can add to your morning routine. It is not a concept you can understand and then deploy. Eliot spent 20 years of his adult life accumulating more understanding than almost any person alive. More literary knowledge, more theological precision, more diagnoses of what had gone wrong. And that accumulation did not produce the still point. The still point appeared when something else happened, when he stopped trying to think his way back to feeling and learned a different mode of attention. This is the inversion I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it reorganizes everything that came before it. The dissociation of sensibility, severed knowing and feeling. The natural response to that severance, the response that every intelligent, serious person reaches for, is to think more carefully about it, to analyze it more precisely, to understand the wound with sufficient depth that the understanding heals it. That is what The Wasteland is. That is what Ash Wednesday is. That is, if you're honest, probably what you've been doing with your cold faith and your estranged child, and your grief about the country, trying to understand it precisely enough that the precision produces resolution. But the dissociation can't be thought away. The instrument you're using, the analyzing, categorizing, carefully reasoning mind, is the same instrument that is, in some sense, expressing the wound. More analysis produces more analysis. It doesn't produce the still point, what 4 quartets enacts, and this is the narrator's reading, not a line Eliot wrote, is a different kind of attention. Not analysis, not feeling, in the romantic sense of simply letting emotion run. Something quieter and more active than either, a willingness to be present to what you already know without trying to do something with it. To let the creed be the creed, without immediately analyzing whether you feel it. To sit with the loss of your child without immediately reaching for the explanation that might make the loss manageable. To be, for a moment, at the center of the turning world, rather than trying to understand the turning from the outside. The mystics called this contemplation, John of the Cross called it passive purification, Eliot called it the still point. He arrived at it not by becoming less intelligent, but by learning that his intelligence had a range, and that some things were outside its range, waiting for him on the other side of it. 4 Quartets is not a poem that explains this. It is a poem that enacts it. When it works on you, when you sit with it long enough, it does not produce understanding so much as a particular quality of attention. The poem itself is a practice. And Eliot knew this. He was not describing the still point from a position of having permanently arrived. He was writing his way toward it, section by section, quartet by quartet, from inside the same turning world. The last documented period of Eliot's life is, by most accounts, one of genuine happiness. In 1957, when he was 68 years old, he married Valerie Fletcher, his secretary, who was 30 years younger and had, by her own account, loved him from a distance for years. The marriage lasted until his death in 1965. People who knew him in those years described a man who had, in some essential way, come through something. Not a man who had solved the dissociation. Not a man who had achieved the still point as a permanent condition, but a man who had found, on the other side of decades of precise, painful, honest attention, a quality of life that was lighter than what had come before. He still wrote serious things. He still cared about what was happening to Western civilization and to the church. But there was, and this is verified in letters, in the accounts of friends, something like ease. Something like the thing that happens when you stop carrying a diagnosis and simply live in the aftermath of having been accurately diagnosed. Also, he had written, in 1939, a book of delightful, silly poems about cats. The same man. The man who wrote The Wasteland also wrote about Jinyanadots, the old Gumby cat, and Macavity the mystery cat. I mention this not as a footnote, but as a data point. The depth and the lightness were not in competition. The still point, when Eliot found it, did not make him less himself. It made him more. Now, we've come far enough that I want to name what this video has actually been about, because I don't think it was about what it appeared to be about at the beginning. This was not a video about analysis paralysis. It was not about smart people and decision-making. It was about the specific suffering of a person who has spent decades building a life around what they know about God, about faith, about their family, about their country, and who finds at some point in the second half that knowing has not been enough, that the distance between understanding and inhabiting remains. Eliot's diagnosis is that this distance is not a personal failure. It is a civilizational wound, transmitted through every institution, every education, every form of serious modern thought. You didn't create the dissociation, you inherited it. His life is evidence that the wound is not permanent, not because it can be thought away, it can't, but because there is a different kind of attention available. The still point is not a technique. It is what becomes possible when you stop asking your intelligence to do a job it was never designed to do, and begin to be present to what you already, at some level, know. The last of the four quartets ends with a passage that is frequently quoted and frequently misunderstood, stripped of the decades of living that gave it its weight. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started, and know the place for the first time. This is not a poem about restlessness as virtue. It is a poem about the specific experience of a person who has gone through, not around, who has lived inside the wound and come out the other side, and found that what was waiting for them at the end was not something new, but something they had always had access to and had been unable to receive. That is the still point. You have always been near it. The question is not whether it exists. The question is what mode of attention is required to find it. I want to leave you with something smaller and more specific than everything I've said. Eliot spent 20 years between the wasteland and four quartets, living inside the wound he had diagnosed with such precision. 20 years is a long time. But the poems from those 20 years, Ash Wednesday, the aerial poems, the fragments that didn't cohere into larger work, were not wasted years. They were, in retrospect, the years the still point required. The years of being present to the darkness without demanding that the darkness resolve itself on a schedule. If you've been in your glass room for 5 years, or 15 or 40, I won't tell you the exit is simple. Eliot didn't find it simple. But I will tell you that the exit is not where you've been looking. It is not at the end of a better explanation. It is not in a more precise diagnosis of what went wrong with the church, or the country, or the child you raised to believe and watched walk away. It is in the place Eliot found, slowly, through decades of honest attention. The still point at the center of everything that is turning. Where the dance is. Where what you know and what you feel stop being two things. That place is not behind you. The only question, the one I want to leave you with, smaller and deeper than everything that came before it, is what you will do with the time that's still ahead of you, now that you have the name. If you've known what you believe for decades and still feel the distance between knowing it and living inside it, tell me when that started. I read everyone,